The rain came down hard on Seattle that October night, the kind of rain that didn't clean anything. It just made the darkness heavier. Inside Ashwood Private Medical Institute, the fourth floor smelled of antiseptic and something older, something that didn't belong in a hospital, something that had walked through centuries of blood and fire and war and was now, impossibly, stubbornly, still breathing. Room 412 was at the end of the hall. The nurses called it the quiet room. Not because it was quiet, because everyone who went in came out quieter. He had arrived 3 days ago. No ambulance, no emergency intake. A black vehicle with tinted windows had pulled into the private bay at 2 in the morning, and 4 men in dark coats had carried him in on a stretcher. The admitting physician on duty, a young resident named Colby, had taken one look at the patient's chart, then one look at the patient's eyes, and had immediately called the senior administrator at home. The patient's name was Aldrich Voss. To the human staff, he was listed as a private individual of considerable means, 62 years of age, admitted for a severe chronic infection of the right leg, a wound that had, according to the chart, gone untreated for an extraordinarily long time. To those who knew the older world, the hidden world that ran beneath the surface of this one, like a river beneath a frozen lake, he was something else entirely. He was King Aldrich Voss, sovereign of the Eastern Vampire Courts, lord of 6 territories spanning 2 continents, a man, if man was still the right word, who had walked the earth for 6 centuries without ever once lowering his head to another living soul. And now he was sitting on the edge of a hospital bed in a paper gown, refusing to let anyone touch him. The charge nurse, a practical woman named Harriet, stood at the station and rubbed her temples. 3 nurses in 2 days. The first had been dismissed with a single look, a look so cold, so ancient, that she'd handed in her badge and requested a floor transfer before her shift ended. The second had made the mistake of using a soothing voice, the kind reserved for difficult elderly patients. He had told her, in precise and unhurried language, exactly what he thought of her tone. She had not come back. The third, a large, experienced man named Douglas, who had worked oncology for 11 years and believed he had seen everything, had lasted 40 minutes. He came out of room 412 walking fast and not looking back, and when Harriet asked what happened, Douglas said only, his eyes changed color. "I'm done." Harriet looked down at the board. The infection markers from this morning's labs were worse. The necrotic tissue in the right thigh was spreading. Whatever was killing Aldrich Voss was patient and methodical, and it did not care how many centuries he had survived. If someone didn't get into that room tonight, he would lose the leg, maybe more. From the far end of the nurse's station, a figure stood up. She had been there the whole time, sitting alone at the last desk, reading a chart, saying nothing. She was 34, with dark hair pulled back tightly, and the kind of stillness that didn't come from peace. It came from exhaustion so deep it had become structural, something load-bearing. Her name badge read, Dr. Mara Finn, Clinical Nurse Specialist. She said, "I'll take him." Harriet looked at her carefully. "You've read the file." "I've read it." "Then you know what he is." Mara picked up the dressing kit and the IV tray. Her movements were precise and economic, the movements of someone who had learned long ago not to waste a single motion. "I know what he is. I also know what his leg looks like, and if we don't flush that wound tonight, he won't need to worry about intimidating anyone else." She walked down the corridor without waiting for an answer. She did not knock. In her experience, men like Aldrich Voss did not appreciate the courtesy of a knock. They appreciated presence, the willingness to enter a room without permission, without apology, without flinching. She pushed the door open and walked in. The room was dim. The blinds were pulled tight. The air held something unusual, not just the hospital smell, but something underneath it. Mineral and cold, like the air inside a very old stone building. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, not lying down, sitting, shirtless, which told her immediately that he'd torn off whatever gown the last nurse had managed to get onto him. His torso was a map of centuries, old scars that had healed with supernatural speed but left their ghost marks anyway, pale ridges and darker lines crossing each other like longitude and latitude on a globe that had been through every war the world had ever seen. His hair was white, not gray, white, the color of bone, pulled back from a face that was severe and angular, carved by time into something beyond ordinary age. He looked like a man in his early 60s, the way a cathedral looks old, not worn down, concentrated. His eyes were silver. They fixed on her the moment she walked in, not moving, not blinking. The eyes of something that had watched empires rise and fall and had never once looked away. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, a measurement. "Dr. Fenn, I'm your nurse for the night shift. I don't need a nurse." His voice was low and unhurried and carried the authority of someone who had been obeyed for so long that the concept of being refused had become genuinely foreign to him. "I need to be left alone. Whatever you were told to do, go do it somewhere else." Mara set the tray on the counter. "Your wound needs to be flushed, Mr. Voss. The infection is tracking along old scar tissue. If we don't address it tonight, the necrosis will reach the muscle belly by morning." Then it reaches the muscle belly. She turned and looked at him. "You're not interested in treatment. I'm not interested in being managed by a human woman with a tray of instruments and a professional smile." He watched her face as he said it, looking for the flinch. "You're the fourth one they've sent. You'll leave the same way the others did." Mara pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. She did not open the dressing kit. She did not reach for the tray. She simply sat, hands folded in her lap, and looked back at him. The silence held. "You're not afraid of me," Aldrich said. Something different had entered his voice. Not warmth, closer to curiosity. "I'm very tired," Mara said. "Fear takes energy I don't have." He studied her. Something behind those silver eyes was shifting, recalculating. "Most people, human or otherwise, feel something instinctive when they look at me, something that tells them to be careful." "I feel it," she said. "I'm choosing to ignore it. There's a difference." Another silence. "You said the infection is tracking along old scar tissue," he said finally. "Yes, the primary wound is a shrapnel scar, approximately 12 years old, based on tissue density. Whatever happened to you in 2012, the wound was never properly cleaned. The silver debris is still in there, breaking down in fragments, poisoning the tissue slowly." His jaw tightened. "You've been thorough." "It's my job." "It's more than your job," he said. "The last 3 didn't read the chart that carefully." He was watching her with a focus that felt like pressure, the kind of attention that 6 centuries of reading people had sharpened into something close to surgical. Mara felt it and kept her face still. "Take off the old dressing," she said. "I need to look at the wound." He didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached down and began unwrapping the bandage himself, not because she had told him to, she understood, but because it was still, marginally, under his control. What she saw beneath the bandage was bad. She had worked enough cases, in enough different circumstances, in enough different kinds of chaos, that she didn't let bad things show on her face. But this was bad. The tissue around the old scar was blackened and swollen, the silver toxicity spreading outward in dark veins beneath the skin. The smell was distinct, not ordinary infection, something older, the particular damage that silver did to vampire tissue, a slow, corrosive breakdown, patient as rust. She reached for the saline. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know what pain feels like." She believed him. She soaked the dressing and began to work. He gripped the side rail with one hand, knuckles pale, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He didn't make a sound. Whatever 6 centuries had built in him included a capacity for silence in the face of agony that she had rarely seen in anyone. "Talk to me," she said. "No." "It helps to focus somewhere else." I don't need to focus somewhere else. I need you to be quiet and do your work." She kept working. The silence stretched. Then, "Blackwood," she said quietly. The hand on the side rail went still. "That's where the shrapnel came from," she said. Her voice was flat and clinical. "Blackwood Forest, 2012. The wound pattern is consistent." Aldrich said nothing. "Guard Brennan," she said. "He died at 3:17 in the afternoon. He was asking about dinner, what was being served back at the hall, about 4 minutes before the ambush started." The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of a difficult patient enduring treatment. It was the silence of a man who had just heard a name he hadn't expected to hear, spoken by a voice he couldn't account for. He turned his head and looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I read your file." "That is not in my file." She didn't answer. His eyes narrowed. He was looking at her differently now, not measuring her nerve anymore, searching for something specific, something he wasn't sure he would find. She felt the weight of that attention and kept her breathing even and her face still, and she worked. Then she reached across him for the fresh dressing. Her sleeve caught on the bed rail. The fabric pulled back past her wrist, exposing the inside of her forearm. The mark had been there for 12 years. She had dressed around it, worked around it, built an entire life around not thinking about it. It was old enough now that the lines had softened slightly, but it was still clear, still unmistakable. A circle of interlocking geometric lines, precise as clockwork, surrounding a single glyph in the old script, the script that predated written human language. Inside the circle, the word Valkyra. Beneath it, cutting through diagonally, a scar, thin and pale. The signature of a silver blade. She pulled her sleeve down. Not fast enough. Aldrich had stopped breathing. She kept her hands on the fresh dressing and focused on the wound and kept her face exactly as it was. Professional, neutral, tired. "Where?" he said. His voice had changed entirely. The authority was still there, but underneath it now was something raw and unguarded. "Where did you get that mark?" "A long time ago," she said. "It doesn't matter." "Look at me." She looked at him. His silver eyes were searching, stripping away the dark circles and the hospital lighting and the years, trying to reconstruct something he was afraid to reconstruct. "They told me," he said slowly, "that everyone in the lead vehicle was killed. Blackwood Forest, the Valkyra unit attached to the forward position." He paused. "They told me there were no survivors." Mara said nothing. "I ordered the search closed after 48 hours. His voice had gone careful, deliberate. The way a man walks out onto ice he isn't sure will hold. "The intelligence report confirmed the casualties. I signed the order myself." Still, she said nothing. "You were in that vehicle," he said. Mara set the last piece of tape on the fresh dressing. She gathered the used instruments onto the tray. Her movements were exactly as precise as when she walked in. She stood up. She looked at him, at the king who had signed the order that left her in a ditch in Blackwood Forest for 6 days with 2 dead men and a leg that wouldn't work. "You signed that order on a Thursday," she said. "I know because I was still alive on Thursday. I counted the days by the light coming through the leaves." She picked up the tray. "Your dressing is clean. The wound needs flushing again in 6 hours." She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, did not turn around. "I'm not here because of you," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear. "I'm here because Guard Brennan deserves to have someone alive long enough to remember his name. That's all." She walked out. The door clicked shut. In room 412, in the heavy dark, King Aldrich Voss sat very still on the edge of his bed. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had signed treaties and held swords and shaped centuries of history. He looked at the fresh bandage on his leg. He looked at the door. For the first time in a very long time he had nothing to say. And somewhere in that silence, something that had been sealed shut for 12 years, buried under centuries of authority and the particular armor of men who have survived too much, cracked, just slightly, just enough. The rain came down harder outside. The city carried on, indifferent. And King Aldrich Voss sat alone in the dark and did not send anyone away. Mara did not sleep that night. She spent the first hour at the corner desk finishing her charts. The second hour she spent doing what she always did when something didn't fit. She looked at the paperwork. The hospital's vendor contracts were accessible through the clinical system, and Aegis Biocorp's service agreement ran 43 pages. She read all of it before 4 in the morning. Then she read it again, more slowly, with the particular attention she reserved for documents where the important information was in what was not said rather than what was. By 5 a.m. she understood what was being planned for room 412. By 6 a.m. she understood why Vance had been the one assigned to the case. She sat at the desk in the pre-dawn quiet of the 4th floor and looked at the wall for a while. Then she closed the file, straightened her scrubs, and went to check on her patient. Morning arrived gray and reluctant. On the 4th floor, the night shift handed off to the day team with the exhaustion of people who had spent 8 hours managing the unmanageable. The board showed room 412 flagged in yellow. Patient refused medication, refused vitals check at 3 a.m., had not slept. At 7:45, the elevator doors opened, and Dr. Harold Vance walked in. She had seen his type before, many times in many different rooms. The expensive watch, the residents trailing behind him, trying to mirror his confidence. The way he looked at a patient chart, the way other men looked at a balance sheet, always calculating, always converting human suffering into institutional arithmetic. He was 61, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades being told he was the smartest person in every room he entered and had long since stopped questioning it. He did not look at Mara as he passed the desk. She watched him go. Aldrich was standing when Vance walked in, not sitting on the bed, standing at the window with his back to the door, looking out at the gray Seattle morning. His weight was shifted slightly away from the right leg, the only concession his body made to the wound. His hands were clasped behind him. He looked like a man standing at a parapet, surveying territory. Vance looked at his chart. "Mr. Voss, I'm Dr. Vance, Chief of Medicine." He gestured to the residents to arrange themselves around the bed. "We have your overnight results. I'll be direct. The infection markers are significantly elevated. White cell count is climbing. The necrotic tissue in the right thigh has progressed. We've consulted with the surgical team." He paused for the appropriate weight. "The recommendation is immediate amputation at the mid-thigh. We can schedule for this afternoon." The room was very quiet. "Alternatively," Vance continued, "Aegis Biocorp has made available a specialized treatment protocol, a full blood replacement procedure, drawing the compromised blood completely and replacing it with Aegis synthetic compound. It addresses the silver toxicity at the systemic level rather than attempting a localized surgical intervention that carries, at this stage of progression, a poor prognosis." He looked up from the chart and met Aldrich's eyes. He looked back down almost immediately. "We would need your consent by 10 o'clock to begin preparation." Aldrich said, "What does the synthetic replacement involve?" "A full transfusion, complete. The compromised blood is removed, the Aegis compound introduced. The process takes approximately 4 hours. And afterward," Vance hesitated, 1 beat too long, "afterward you will be infection-free." "And what else?" Aldrich said. The hesitation was longer this time. "There may be some changes in Dr. Vance." The voice that said it was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was the voice of a man who had learned, over long centuries, that true authority never needed volume. It only needed certainty. And in that single moment, something in Vance's composure faltered, some deep and animal part of him registering that he was standing in the presence of something very old and very dangerous that was currently exerting enormous restraint. "What else?" Aldrich said. From the corner of the room, Mara stepped forward. She had been there since before Vance arrived, standing against the wall behind the residence. Vance had walked straight past her. "The synthetic replacement doesn't supplement vampire physiology," she said clearly. "It replaces it." Mr. Voss would be infection-free. He would also no longer be what he is. Everything accumulated over centuries, gone, permanently. That is what Aegis sells, Dr. Vance. Not treatment, replacement. Vance turned to her with the expression of a man who has found an insect in a very expensive meal. "Nurse Fenn." "The wound is a pocket infection," Mara continued. She was looking at Aldrich, not Vance, and her voice was flat and precise. "It's tracking along the old scar tissue from 2012, creating a contained channel of silver toxicity. It has not penetrated deep muscle. It has not gone systemic. A targeted surgical debridement with wound drainage will resolve this. No amputation. No replacement." Vance's voice dropped to a register that was very controlled. "You are a nurse. You do not diagnose. You do not contradict surgical recommendation in front of a clinical team. And you certainly do not—" "She's right." Vance stopped. Aldrich had crossed the room. He was standing close to Vance now, close enough that the height difference was impossible to ignore. He looked at him with centuries of experience reading men who smiled while they calculated. "She's right," he said again. "And you know she's right, which means the question I'm interested in is why you're recommending a procedure that would permanently eliminate my biology when a surgical alternative exists. The surgical alternative carries significant risk. Get out. Mr. Voss, get out of this room. Take your residence. Leave the chart." Not a shout, not even raised, just absolute. "Dr. Fenn stays. When I have questions that require your specific expertise, I will ask for you." The residents were already moving. Vance stood still for one moment, calculating whether the ground he was losing was worth fighting for. He looked at Mara. Something crossed his face that lived between anger and fear. He put the chart on the bed and walked out. When the door closed, Aldrich sat down on the edge of the bed. The standing had cost him. He didn't show it beyond the slight adjustment of his posture, but she saw it. Mara pulled the chair close. "He wants your blood," she said. Aldrich looked at her. "Aegis Biocorp is in the building. Their representative arrived last night, the same time your overnight results came back worse." She kept her voice level, each word placed with care. "Aegis has been developing compounds derived from ancient vampire biology for 3 years. A patient with your cellular age would be worth more to their research division than anything they've produced in their entire history. I read their service contract with the hospital this morning. The language around biological material acquisition is buried in Appendix 4, but it's there." She paused. "The replacement procedure isn't a treatment. It's a harvest." Aldrich was quiet. "Vance is being paid," he said. "Vance is being paid." He looked at the window. Outside, the rain had started again. "Who is the representative?" Mara looked at her hands. She had been deciding since approximately 4 in the morning how much to say. The answer she had arrived at was all of it. She had spent 12 years not saying things, and all it had built was a life that fit her like a room that was slightly too small, functional, survivable, but never quite right. "His name is Lord Cassin," she said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. She watched Aldrich's face. She had become skilled, over years of working with patients in extremity, at reading the geography of a face under pressure, the small movements that betrayed what the larger expression was trying to contain. "In 2012, she said, Cassin was the intelligence advisor to the Eastern Court's forward operations. He provided the route clearance assessment for the Blackwood Patrol, the one that put the Valkyra unit in the ambush corridor." She paused. "The assessment was fabricated. The patrol route was sold. The Silver Thorn faction paid him in territorial access rights, which he converted, over the following decade, into the commercial licenses that became Aegis Biocorp." She heard him breathing, measured, controlled. The way a man breathes when he is applying the entirety of his considerable will to remaining still. Brennan died, she said quietly. The whole unit. Because someone told the court the corridor was clear when he already knew it wasn't. Aldrich stood up. He walked to the window. His back was to her, hands clasped behind him, the same posture as when Vance walked in, but entirely different now. This was not a king surveying territory. This was a man trying to hold the shape of himself together when something inside had just given way. "I trusted his assessment," Aldrich said. His voice was very quiet. "I know. I read his report personally. I approved the patrol route." "I know." Brennan was 23 years old. 22, Mara said. His birthday was the following month. The silence stretched. Then Aldrich turned around. His eyes had shifted, the silver gone deep red at the edges, the color change she had been trained in her early years to treat as a warning. But she had learned since that red eyes were not always rage. Sometimes they were grief wearing rage's clothing because grief had nowhere else to go. "Cassin is in this building," he said. "He's been in the executive suite since yesterday afternoon." He nodded once. Something in his posture recalibrated, the anger still present, but ordered now. "Directed. Then we have a problem to solve. But first, the surgery. You said it can save the leg. I believe it can. Then we do that first." He sat back down on the bed. Something in the way he sat had changed, less like a king on a throne, more like a man who had decided to trust someone and was experiencing the unfamiliar weight of that decision. "Tell me what you need, Doctor." Rowan Taft was 29 years old and had been, until 8 months ago, considered the most promising surgical resident in Ashwood's program. 8 months ago, he had made a mistake, a procedural error, caught, corrected no lasting harm to the patient. But Vance had seen it happen, and Vance had filed it quietly in the particular mental folder he kept for useful information about people. Since then, Taft did what Vance told him to do. You could see it in the way he carried himself, the natural confidence of a talented young doctor still present in his posture, but bracketed now by a watchfulness at the edges that didn't belong there. Mara had watched him for 3 weeks before making her assessment. Good hands, good instincts, being slowly broken by a man who needed him compliant. She had specifically requested him for the surgery. The operating room was cold and very bright. Taft stood at the scrub sink, hands under the water, not moving. Through the window above, Vance was already in the observation gallery, arms crossed, watching, waiting for a carcass. "I can't do this," Taft said. His voice was low. "He's up there. If I make one wrong call, he'll pull my file. I'll lose everything." "Look at the patient," Mara said. Taft looked through the glass at the table, at the man lying there, white hair, scarred torso, the right leg prepared and draped. "He has been alive for a very long time," Mara said. "He survived things that should have killed him 100 times over. He made it to this table. All he needs now is someone with good hands and the courage to use them." She turned off her tap. "Vance is not in this room. The only thing in this room is the work." Taft looked at her for a moment. Something in his face reorganized itself around something firmer. He turned off his tap. The first hour was clean. Taft worked well, better than well. He moved through the debridement with a precision that came not just from training, but from instinct, the practiced economy of someone who had a natural feel for tissue, for depth, for the language the body speaks when it is trying to heal. Mara stood at the instrument tray and handed him what he needed before he asked for it. She had done this in conditions that made this operating room look like a sanctuary, and the familiarity of it, the rhythm of good surgical work, the quiet shared language of it, settled something in her that she hadn't realized was unsettled. Then the monitor changed. A shift in the waveform, a pressure reading moving in the wrong direction. Mara saw it 2 seconds before the anesthesiologist called it. Pressure dropping. The old scar tissue, when Taft opened the channel fully, had been concealing a reservoir, a pocket of silver debris from 2012, encapsulated, waiting. When the encapsulation broke, the silver reacted. The tissue responded instantly, a vascular spasm that tore a small branch vessel cleanly. Blood, dark, dense with centuries of vampire biology, began to fill the field. Taft froze. 1 second, 2. In a room where seconds were the currency of survival, it was long enough. "I can't see the source," he said. His voice had gone tight. "The field is compromised." "Taft!" Mara's voice cut across the room. She was already moving into the sterile field. "Look at me." He looked. "I can feel the vessel. I'm going to act as manual compression while you suture around me. Do not look at Vance. Do not think about your file. Think about the next 30 seconds. "You can't. That's not—" "I've done this in a ditch in the dark with no power and one working hand," she said. "You're in a lit room with every instrument you need. Trust me." She put her hand into the wound. She found the vessel by feel, the pulse of it, the location of the tear. She pressed. The bleeding slowed. Above them, Vance had picked up the intercom. She ignored it. "The vessel," she said to Taft. "Suture around my fingers. Small bites. Take your time." Taft looked at her hand in the wound. He looked at her face. He picked up the needle driver. "Don't move," he said. "I'm a statue," she said. He began. What happened in the next 12 minutes existed in the gap between training and instinct, between what you know and what you are. Taft sutured around her fingers with a steadiness that surprised even him, each placement deliberate, the thread catching and holding, the vessel walls approximating under the controlled pressure of her hands. Vance's voice came over the intercom twice. Neither of them heard it. Taft placed the last suture. "Ready," he said. Mara withdrew her hand slowly, monitoring the pulse through her fingertips until she was certain. She stepped back. The monitor steadied. Beep, beep, beep. Taft pressed his free hand over his eyes and just breathed. "Close him," Mara said quietly. "You did it." She looked up at the gallery. Vance was still there. The intercom was down. His arms were no longer crossed. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has watched something he carefully planned go comprehensively wrong and is now calculating what that costs him. He turned and walked out of the gallery without looking back. Recovery was quiet. Aldrich woke slowly, the anesthesia wearing off one sensation at a time. His eyes opened, silver again, clear. He looked down, 2 feet under the sheet. He held that sight for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara, sitting in the chair beside the bed. There was still blood on her cuff that she hadn't had time to clean. "You stayed," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "I said I would." He was quiet. The room hummed softly around them. "In Blackwood," he said. "You said someone found you on the 7th day. You said it wasn't the rescue team." Mara looked at her hands. "It was you," he said. "Wasn't it?" A long silence. "You had a fractured ankle," she said finally. "You'd been separated from your detail during the ambush. You were alone. You covered nearly 2 miles on foot through hostile territory in the dark." She paused. "You found the ditch. You found me. You got me out." She looked up. "You don't remember, because you had a severe concussion by the time the rescue team arrived, but I remember every step." He turned his head and looked at her, not with the measuring quality of before, not with the rawness that Cassin's name had put in his eyes, something older and quieter, the look of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long he has forgotten what it was like to stand without it, and has just been offered unexpectedly the chance to set it down. "I left you behind," he said. "And then, without knowing it, I went back. Yes. And now you are here. Yes." Outside, the rain had stopped. A thin wash of pale afternoon light came through the window and lay across the floor. "Cassin is still in the building," Aldrich said. "He is." "Then we're not done." "No," she said. "We're not." He looked at her steadily. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she agreed. She stood, pulled her jacket straight, and walked to the door. This time she didn't need to look back. She already knew he wasn't going anywhere. The 6th floor of Ashwood Institute did not smell like a hospital. It smelled like money, fresh coffee and leather, and the dry warmth of rooms where decisions are made about other people's lives by people who will never occupy those rooms themselves. The carpet absorbed footsteps completely. The lighting was warm and indirect. Mara took the stairs. She needed the 2 flights. She needed the physical act of climbing, 1 foot, then the next, in a stairwell where nobody could see her, to settle what was moving through her into something she could use. She had been waiting 12 years for this room. The problem with waiting 12 years for something is that it stops feeling real. It becomes theoretical. Safe as long as it stays theoretical. The door at the top of the stairs brought her back. She pushed through it and found the office marked Executive Administration. The door was slightly open. The surgery succeeded. Vance's voice, tight, fraying at the edges. She interfered in the procedure. It was positioned to fail. Instead, the leg is viable, smooth, unhurried. The voice of a man who had spent decades being the calmest person in collapsing rooms. Frederick, one surgery doesn't change the larger picture. If Voss is ambulatory, if he starts making calls to the court, he won't. I've known Aldrich Voss for 30 years. He carries guilt about Blackwood that he's told no one, because men like Voss don't tell anyone anything. That guilt keeps him still. A pause. The nurse is the variable. Deal with the nurse. Mara pushed the door open and walked in. Lord Casson looked exactly as she remembered. That was the thing about men who had done terrible things and prospered. They didn't look different. Older, the silver at his temples gone fully white. A suit that cost more than her monthly salary. A glass of whiskey held with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in borrowed rooms. He looked at her the way powerful men look at interruptions. Vance moved behind the desk. Nurse Fenn, you are trespassing on an administrative floor, Blackwood Forest, Mara said. October 2012. The room changed. Casson's glass stopped moving. She walked forward and stopped 4 feet from him, close enough that he had to look, really look. She let him find the scar on her jaw. She let him work backward through the years. She watched the moment he arrived. You, he said. My name is Dr. Mara Fenn, she said. I was the clinical specialist assigned to the Valkyra Forward Unit. I am the only person alive who can place you at the intelligence briefing 48 hours before the Blackwood Patrol. The briefing where you confirmed the corridor was clear. She kept her voice level. It wasn't clear. You had received payment from the Silverthorn faction 2 days prior. Territorial access rights converted into the founding capital of Aegis Biocorp. Vance started. This is completely... Casson held up a hand, his eyes on Mara. Calculating now, not dismissive. You have no documentation, he said. Classified records. Sealed. I have testimony. Mine. The testimony of a nurse with a trauma history. The smooth voice, fully recovered. A woman who has shown, today alone, a documented pattern of erratic clinical behavior. Who are they going to believe? He set his glass down and stood, almost gentle. You survived Blackwood. Not many people can say that. Consider it enough. It was never going to be enough, she said. She reached into her pocket. The phone screen glowed red. Recording. 0 hours, 4 minutes, 17 seconds. I've been recording since I walked in, she said. The file is already synced. It went to a secure server the moment I stepped onto this floor. She looked at him steadily. Aldrich Voss has the access credentials. He has been awake for 40 minutes. Casson looked at the phone. For the first time, the calculation behind his eyes showed something that was not confidence. He lunged. It was a mistake. She had been waiting for it. Not because she wanted it, but because she knew what lived underneath smooth voices and expensive suits when everything else failed. She sidestepped, caught his wrist, used his momentum the way she had been taught, redirecting rather than overpowering, letting the force coming at her become the force that solved the problem. She put him face down on the mahogany desk. He made a sound that had nothing dignified in it. She leaned close. Her voice was very quiet. "Guard Brennan's birthday would have been November 14th, she said. "He would have been 34 years old this year. He talked about it once, thought it was funny that we were born the same month." She held the arm. "That's for Brennan." Vance was pressed against the far wall, the color gone from his face. Then the door opened. Security came through first, and behind them, moving slowly, each step deliberate. Aldrich Voss, still in the hospital gown, a drip line pulled from his left arm, blood tracking down to his wrist. The IV stand in his right hand, used as a crutch. The leg held beneath him, vampire biology, even compromised, did not forget how to function under pressure. That was both the gift and the curse of what he was. He had dragged himself out of the recovery room. He had taken the stairs. The two security guards looked at him and were immediately uncertain. "Step back," Aldrich said. They stepped back. He looked at Mara, at her hands, at Kassan against the desk. His silver eyes moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who has assessed the aftermath of confrontations for 6 centuries. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He crossed the room. Each step on the right leg cost him. She could see it in his jaw, the slight pause at the weight transfer. He crossed it anyway. He stopped in front of Mara first, not Kassan. Mara. And then, in front of every witness in that room, in front of the man who had bought their silence, and the doctor who had sold his conscience, in front of the security guards who would struggle afterward to describe what they had seen. King Aldrich Voss lowered himself onto one knee. It cost him. The operated leg buckled slightly, and he caught it, and the cane scraped against the carpet, and it was not elegant. 600 years of sovereignty does not kneel gracefully, but he held it. He stayed down. "I signed the order that closed the search," he said. His voice carried in the silence of the room the way it always carried, not because it was loud, but because it was absolute. "I trusted a man I never verified. I sent you into a corridor I should have questioned. And when the report came back, I chose to believe it because believing it was easier than finding what I was afraid to find." He looked up at her. "You were in that ditch for 6 days. I want you to hear this from my mouth, in this room, in front of the man responsible. I failed you, not as a king, as the man who signed your name off as lost." The room was completely still. Kassan said nothing. Vance said nothing. Mara looked down at him, at the white hair and the silver eyes and everything 6 centuries had built, temporarily, entirely set aside, kneeling on a carpet in a hospital gown with blood on his arm. She was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to control. She had carried the shape of this moment for 12 years without knowing its shape, had imagined it angry, imagined it cold, imagined herself unmoved by it. She had not imagined this. She had not imagined that it would feel less like a door opening and more like something finally, permanently, being set down. "Get up, Aldrich," she said quietly. He got up. "Now finish this," she said. And she turned away so he wouldn't see her face. He turned to Kassan. "I have been deciding," he said, "what to say to you when I was in the same room as you." He looked at Kassan without blinking. "What you built, Aegis, the contracts, the influence, all of it stands on Brennan's bones, on the bones of everyone in that corridor. Every day it has stood, it has been an insult to people who deserved better." He looked at the security lead. "Call the police. I am King Aldrich Voss, and I am placing this man under arrest for conspiracy and fraud." He turned away from Kassan, as though he had ceased to be interesting. He looked at Vance. "Get out of my sight," he said. The arrest did not happen quietly. The recording, 6 minutes and 43 seconds of two powerful men speaking with the candor of people who believed they were not being heard, was in the hands of 3 journalists and 2 attorneys before the police arrived on the 6th floor. By the time Kassin was walked through the lobby in handcuffs, the first calls were already hitting Ashwood's administrative lines. Aegis Biocorp's board convened an emergency session before the evening news cycle. Vance lost his clinical privileges pending review. Dr. Rowan Taft, whose file Vance had been holding for 8 months, was quietly informed that the documentation in question had been improperly recorded and would be expunged. Taft went home that night and sat in his car for a long time before going inside. The window of his apartment was lit. His wife was waiting. He went in. 6 months later. Scotland in April was cold and startlingly green, the kind of landscape designed to make everything feel ancient and worth remembering. Dusk Castle sat in the middle of it as it had always sat, 12 centuries of stonework, built to the understanding that some things are meant to endure. The great hall had been opened for the first time in years. Aldrich walked without the IV stand. He walked with a cane, black wood, silver eagle's head, and the right leg carried its history in every step, stiff and scarred and present. He stood at the entrance and looked at the people assembled inside. They had come from 6 countries, some old, some young, all of them holding the particular posture of people who had traveled a long distance for something they weren't entirely sure was real. The hall went quiet when he entered. He walked to the center of the room. "At ease," he said. Then, before the noise could build, "I didn't come alone." He turned to the entrance. "Ghost healer," he said. The name moved through the hall like something that had been waiting a long time to be spoken here. Mara walked in, dark jacket, plain shirt, her hair down. She looked exactly like what she was, a 34-year-old woman who had been through a great deal and come out the other side still standing, which was its own kind of extraordinary. The blood seal on her wrist was visible. She had stopped hiding it. A man near the front, broad-shouldered, a scar running from his left ear to his collar, stared at her. He looked at the seal. He looked at the scar on her jaw. He looked at her face. "Valkyra," he said. Barely a sound. "Sergeant Galt," Mara said. "How's the shoulder?" He crossed the room and wrapped her in a hold that lifted her off the floor. Then the hall came apart. Not with discipline or protocol, with the uncontrolled recognition of people who had thought something was gone and discovered it was not. There was noise, and people moving faster than dignity allowed, and from a silver-haired woman at the back who had served the Valkyra unit's logistics in 2012, a sound that was unmistakably grief-releasing into something that was not grief anymore. Mara stood in the middle of it. She did not manage it or deflect it or make it smaller. She let it be exactly what it was. Later, when the hall had settled into warmth and voices and the particular comfort of people who had found each other after too long, Aldrich and Mara stood on the east balcony. The night was clear and cold. Below the castle, the valley held the last of the light, a pale silver that recalled, without stating it, a great many things. Aldrich looked out at the dark. "I spent 500 years building," he said. "Courts, alliances, structures meant to last. I thought that was what a life was for." He was quiet for a moment. "The last 100 I was managing what I'd built. The last 12, I was letting it carry me and calling that living." He turned and looked at her. "You walked into that room without knocking," he said. "You didn't run when I told you to. You put your hand into an open wound and held it shut, and told a frightened young doctor to trust you." He paused. "I had forgotten that existed. Someone deciding the truth was worth more than the safety of staying quiet." Mara looked at the valley. "Brennan used to say," she said, "that the only thing worth doing with a hard thing was to do it in the direction of something real." A pause. "He was 22. I thought he was being philosophical." Aldrich reached into his coat and produced 2 glasses and a bottle sealed in dark wax. He poured. He handed one to her. She looked at the glass. She looked at him. She rolled her sleeve up, left it there. The blood seal in the pale light. The old lines softened by years, but permanent. The scar through its center, a mark she had spent a long time hiding and was finished hiding. She raised the glass. "To Brennan," she said. "To Brennan," he said. "And every one of them who didn't come back." Below, through the stone walls, the sounds of the hall carried on. Voices, laughter, the sound of people who had found each other again and were not yet ready to be quiet. Aldrich looked at the valley. 600 years, he said. And the thing I will remember, when the rest of it is weighed, is a woman who did not knock. Mara said nothing for a moment. Then, you needed someone who wouldn't. I did, he said. The stars held. The valley held the last of the light. And the silence between them was no longer the silence of wounds or walls or words that couldn't find their way out. It was the silence of two people who had found, against considerable odds, that they were no longer alone.